I'm not wearing that thrift store thing. If Mom asks, tell her it doesn't fit. The words cut through the half-open dressing room door like a cold wind through thin glass. I froze in the hallway, my hands still clutching the garment bag. 6 months of work folded between my fingers. 6 months of evenings with a silver thimble pressing into my thumb. My old singer humming in the attic while snow piled against the Michigan windows. The air smelled of steamed silk and hairspray. Laughter rose from inside. Young, careless laughter that didn't know the price of sacrifice. My breath caught. My knees wobbled. For a moment, I thought I'd drop the bag right there. Just smile if she brings it in. My daughter added, her voice light, almost cheerful. The bag's zipper felt cold in my palm. My mind rushed back to the first stitch. The pearl buttons I ordered from a shop in Vermont. The lace I found at a yard sale in Traverse City. So delicate I held my breath unrolling it. I'd pictured her eyes lighting up the way they did when she was 6 and tried on the Easter dress I made overnight. But now, that little girl was gone. I stepped back, letting the voices fade. The patterned carpet under my feet blurred. Someone walked past, perfume heavy with roses, and I thought of how I'd sewn tiny rosebuds into the hem as a secret blessing. In the mirror at the end of the hall, I caught sight of myself, hair pinned too tight, dress pressed for the occasion. A mother trying to belong in her daughter's new world. I turned, walked toward the exit. My shoes tapped softly against the marble, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the March air was damp and sharp. Lake Michigan's wind found its way under my coat. I sat in my car and laid the garment bag across the back seat. My fingers lingered on the fabric through the plastic. Silk remembers touch, and this dress remembered mine. The radio played a song from 1974, one I used to hum while rocking her crib. I switched it off. At home, I carried the dress upstairs. My sewing room smelled faintly of lavender sachets and machine oil. I hung the dress in the window's pale light. The bodice shimmered, the beadwork catching the late afternoon sun. It looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. A sharp ache settled behind my ribs. Not just for the wasted work, but for the truth it revealed. My place in her life had shifted. I was no longer the safe harbor, the one she ran to. I was an afterthought. The phone buzzed, her name on the screen. I let it ring. Downstairs, I made tea. The kettle's whistle was too loud in the quiet house. Steam rose curling like the threads I'd trimmed from the dress's seams. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her laugh, that line, thrift store thing, echoing. At 2 in the morning, I went back upstairs. I ran my hand over the dress one last time, then zipped the bag shut. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. Not out of anger. That burns too fast. But out of something colder, steadier. The kind of resolve you find when you've been underestimated one time too many. I would not beg her to wear it. I would not explain myself. I would not let her see me hurt. Instead, I would find a place where this dress, and I, would be valued. Somewhere, a bride would see it for what it was, not a thrift store thing, but a labor of love. And as for my daughter, she'd have her wedding day exactly as she wanted. But the story of that day would not be the one she expected. When Lillian was little, she never liked store-bought dresses. We couldn't afford much, but she didn't know that. To her, the Easter dress with the pale blue sash was magic. She didn't see me hunched over the singer at 2 in the morning, measuring twice because fabric was precious. Back then, the house always smelled faintly of starch and sugar cookies. I'd bake while I sewed, letting the cookies cool on the counter so the whole place felt warm when she woke. She'd come down the hall, hair sticking up, dragging her worn blanket. "Is it done yet?" she'd ask, even before breakfast. I'd lift the dress from the chair and her eyes would go wide, fingers hovering over the buttons. Those buttons were my weakness. I'd search flea markets and thrift shops for something special. Pearl, mother of pearl glass. Anything that would make her feel set apart. She'd twirl until she got dizzy, laughing until she collapsed on the rug. Michigan winters made the attic cold, but I'd work there anyway. Space heaters hummed by my feet, the window frosted over. The hum of the sewing machine was my rhythm, a steady promise that each stitch was for her. We had our rituals. Saturday mornings, we'd walk downtown, stop at the fabric store. She'd pick colors too bright, patterns too busy, but I'd buy a yard anyway. It was our secret rebellion. Her choices stitched into the lining, where no one else would see. When she hit high school, she started asking for simpler designs. Something I can wear to a party without looking like a doll. She'd say, rolling her eyes. Still, she'd let me add a hidden detail. a rosebud at the hem, a lace panel inside the bodice. College changed her. She came home with a suitcase full of clothes from department stores, tags still on. My sewing room became just another spare room. She said she was too busy to help pick fabric, too grown up for fittings. But last winter, when she told me she wanted a handmade dress for her wedding, I felt something in me spark. "Are you sure?" I'd asked, careful not to sound too eager. "Of course, Mom," she'd said. "It would mean a lot." So I went back to the attic, back to the hum of the singer, back to late nights with strong tea and aching fingers. I ordered silk from a supplier in New York, lace from Vermont, beads from a woman in Oregon who wrote me a thank you note for keeping the old ways alive. Each piece of that dress had a story. The lace reminded me of her first communion. The beadwork echoed the tiara she'd worn at her sweet 16. I sewed it all in quietly, believing she'd see it. Spring came early that year. I remember carrying the nearly finished dress to the window and watching sunlight spill across it. The fabric seemed to breathe. I imagined her standing in it by the lake, the wind off Lake Michigan lifting the veil. But imagination can be cruel. I thought making this dress would bring us back to those mornings in the kitchen, the twirling in the living room. Instead, it brought me to a hallway outside a dressing room, listening to her call it a thrift store thing. Now, sitting here in my attic, I can still hear her laugh. Not the child's laugh from years ago, but something sharper, meant for someone else. I glance at the singer. The motor's still warm from the last stitch I made before the fitting. I should cover it, turn out the light. Instead, I reach for the sketch pad. The page is blank. Maybe it's time to make something new, but not for her. It happened 3 days later. We were in the resort's lobby, waiting for the florist to arrive. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies. I held the garment bag, feeling its weight in my arms like an anchor. Lillian stood with 2 of her bridesmaids. They were scrolling on their phones, giggling over something. One of them glanced at the bag I carried. "Is that the dress?" she asked. Before I could answer, Lillian laughed. "Oh, that's just Mom's project. We'll see if it makes the cut." The bridesmaids smiled politely, but their eyes slid away. My cheeks burned. My fingers tightened on the handle. I wanted to remind her of her words, of how she'd said it would mean a lot. But my voice caught in my throat. A bellman passed by with a cart of white roses. The scent was too sweet, cloying. I stepped back, pretending to admire the arrangements. The conversation shifted, but the sting stayed. My ears buzzed, my chest heavy. She was talking about me, not to me. A man at the front desk asked if we needed help. I shook my head and walked toward the window. Outside, snow flurries spun in the gray air. I had never felt so visible and invisible at the same time. From behind me, her voice carried again. "We might have to buy a backup, just in case." The words dropped like stones in my stomach. I turned, managing a small smile. "You'll have what you need," I said quietly. No one replied. The chatter froze. Forks hovered mid-air. I looked up from my plate, the steam from the roast chicken curling into my face like a taunt. We were at Daniel's parents' lake house. Their idea of a casual Sunday dinner. Casual here meant crystal glasses and napkins folded into swans. I had driven an hour, clutching my famous pecan pie in the passenger seat, thinking, maybe this time, it would feel like family. Lillian didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes were fixed on her mother-in-law, who gave a polite little laugh, the kind that says, "Oh, we understand each other." Daniel swirled his wine, pretending to study the dark red in his glass. I laid my fork down. My hand was steady. My chest was not. Location, actions, thoughts, emotions, dialogue. That's what my late husband Tom used to call holding the moment. He was right. If you hold it still, you see it for what it is. The room smelled of rosemary and lake damp wood. Candles flickered against the glass cabinets. The silverware chimed every time someone moved. I noticed all of it because it kept me from noticing the heat in my face. "So you're saying I can't be trusted?" My voice was quiet, each word trimmed of anything but truth. Lillian finally turned, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Mom, don't be so dramatic. I just meant you forget things. You get flustered. It's natural at your age. Natural at your age. Like forgetting was my defining feature now. Like the woman who'd run a business, balanced books, and raised her alone was gone, replaced by some fragile placeholder." Daniel cleared his throat. "Let's not turn this into something big." "Already turned, dear boy. Already bigger than you know." I reached for my glass of water, letting the cool sweat on the rim calm my fingers. Outside the window, the lake was dark and still, a flat mirror to the bruised blue sky. I remembered the sewing room last winter, hands raw from hours of beating, lamp light catching on the silk, the hum of the heater. How I'd wrapped the gown in tissue like it was glass. How I'd believed my work meant something. "You could have just said you didn't want my help," I told her, still soft, still even. "Oh, but you do help, Mom," she said, and the table laughed. The sound was warm for them, cold for me. I saw the pity in Delia's eyes from across the table. She was a neighbor, not family, invited because she'd brought a vintage wine Daniel liked. Her glance told me she'd heard more than she wanted to. Pity is heavy. It sits on you long after the night ends. The server, young, nervous, set down a dish of butter beans beside me. "Would you like?" "No," Lillian cut in. "She'll spill." A quick, sharp, efficient. The boy blinked, unsure who to obey. I folded my napkin slowly, pressing the edges crisp. "Go ahead," I said to him, and he served me without another word. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not for them. They didn't see it. But for me. You can't unhear disrespect. You can only decide what to do with it. Daniel's father poured more wine, launching into a story about his golf handicap. Lillian nodded along, all smiles again, as though the barb had dissolved into the rosemary air. But I felt it, a splinter lodged deep. I let the conversation wash over me. My eyes wandered to the sideboard, where an envelope sat under a crystal paperweight. Thick cream stock, my name in Delia's looping script. I'd seen one like it before, an invitation to the annual bridal showcase in town. My guess? This one wasn't for me. Not yet? But it could be. The thought landed quietly like a seed in soil. You can plant a garden in winter if you know what will bloom. I helped clear plates after dessert. Lillian handed me the lighter trays. Daniel's mother thanked me as though I were the hired help. In the kitchen, the scent of lemon soap cut through the meat and wine. I rinsed each dish slowly, giving my mind room to work. What had been a casual dinner was now a ledger in my head, column of slights, column of truths, both growing. "Mom, you don't have to do that," Lillian called from the doorway. I turned, drying my hands. "I know," and kept going. Later, as I stepped into the cold night, pie dish tucked under my arm, the air was sharp with pine. My car's headlights swept the gravel drive, catching a shimmer on the lake beyond. The stars were thin and far away. The envelope on the sideboard stayed in my mind the whole ride home. By the time I reached my front porch, I'd decided I wouldn't wait to be invited. I'd make my own place at that table, and it wouldn't be here. I set the pie dish in the sink, turned on the kettle, and opened my sewing room door. The scent of fabric, of oil and thread, met me like an old friend. The dress form stood in the center, draped in the beginnings of something new. Not a wedding gown, not yet. But maybe the start of a whole line. Some insults burn you down. Others, they light a match. "Mom, can you pick up the champagne order for us? We're just too busy." The text pinged while I was kneeling on the sewing room floor, trimming a hem. The scissors glinted in the light, their cool weight steady in my hand. My knees ached on the hardwood. It was late afternoon, the winter sun sliding away, and my hands were raw from the dry air. Champagne order. For their rehearsal dinner. I knew the store. 2 hours round trip, expensive bottles, the kind with labels in gold foil. I also knew they'd expect me to pay and get reimbursed later. I set the scissors down. My breath came out slow. In the kitchen, the table was a mess of mail, receipts, and the grocery list I'd started. I pushed aside a flyer for a winter clearance sale and pulled my old ledger toward me. The cover was worn leather, the edges curled from years of use. I opened it to a blank page, one column for materials, one for labor, one for extras, things no one thinks about until you have to buy them. I began with the gown. Silk charmeuse from New York 60/40, imported glass beads from Vermont in 180, French lace trim 2920, thread boning hidden zipper 74. I tapped my pen. That was just the fabric. Next, labor. I charged $45 an hour when I took commissions years ago. At that rate, 6 months of work, even counting only 4 hours a day, came to nearly $32. I stared at the number. My chest felt tight like the air had thickened. That gown wasn't just a gift. It was an investment, an inheritance in cloth, and she'd tossed it aside like a cardigan from the clearance rack. The kettle clicked off. I poured hot water over a tea bag, the steam curling into my face. The scent of black tea was grounding, but my mind wouldn't settle. I thought of the champagne order again. How many bottles? How much per case? My guess? Another 500 at least, enough to pay for my heating bill and groceries for a month. I sipped my tea and kept writing. There were the travel costs, gas for trips to fabric shops, parking fees in the city, the meals I'd skipped because I was in the middle of stitching beadwork, The nights I'd kept the lights on until 2 a.m., adding another few dollars to the utility bill. Value is funny. If you give it away, people think it costs nothing. But when you put it on paper, it stares back at you undeniable. The phone rang. The old landline, the one only a handful of people used. I picked it up. "Margaret? It's Delia. I was just thinking about you." Her voice was warm, familiar. She ran a bridal shop downtown and had a knack for sensing when someone needed a call. "I saw your post," she said. "The one with the pearl applique, eh? Who's that for?" I hesitated. It was for Lillian. A pause. "Wuss?" I told her about the wedding, the dress, the insult. Not every word, just enough for her to understand. "You know," Delia said, "if you ever wanted to take orders again, I've got brides who would kill for work like yours." I laughed, short and low. "It's been a while." "Doesn't matter. Talent doesn't expire. We talked about the bridal fair coming up." She mentioned an open spot in her booth. Someone had dropped out last minute. I could bring a few pieces, maybe pick up clients. My mind flashed to the cream envelope I'd seen on the sideboard at Daniel's parents' house. "I'll think about it," I told her. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen. The light outside had faded to blue, and the house felt wrapped in wool. I looked back at my ledger. The numbers didn't lie. 6 months of work, thousands in materials, countless hours, dismissed without a thought. The next morning, I drove to the liquor store. The champagne order was ready, 6 cases stacked by the counter, each bottle nestled in gold foil. The clerk wheeled them out and slid the receipt across to me. A 5-12-76. I handed over my debit card. It felt heavier than the cases. At home, I set the receipt on top of the ledger. 2 columns now, what I'd given, what I'd spent. Both far longer than the column marked what I've received. I pulled the gown from its garment bag. The silk slid over my hands, cool and alive. I traced the beading along the bodice, each stitch as neat as the day I'd made it. It deserved better than the back of a closet, or the backhand of a careless remark. I found myself at the sewing table again, sketching without thinking, not a wedding gown this time, something sleek, modern for a woman who wanted to walk into a room and be remembered. My pencil moved fast, lines sharp, the image in my head clear. By evening, the kitchen smelled of tomato soup and buttered toast. I ate at the table with the ledger open beside me. Across the page in bold letters, I wrote, "Ves nenomor efra work." The words settled in my chest like an anchor. Not a burden, something solid to hold on to. I folded the ledger shut. Tomorrow, I'd call Delia back. Tomorrow, I'd ask about that open booth at the bridal fair. Tomorrow, I'd start moving the numbers from one column to another, from loss to gain. In the corner of the sewing room, the dress form waited. The new design was still only lines on paper, but I could already see it finished, hanging in a shop window, the kind of piece that made people stop and stare. Some debts you can't collect in dollars, but you can collect in dignity. "Mom, we're meeting with the florist today. It's just too hectic to have extra people in the room." The call ended before I could answer. I sat at the kitchen table, the phone still warm in my hand, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Outside, the lake was pale under a thin morning fog. The kind of day that asks for company, and gave me none. I tried to picture the florist's shop. Buckets of roses, stems trimmed, ribbons ready. I'd been there before, helping Lillian pick flowers for her high school dance. Now, apparently, I was extra. I rinsed my mug, the coffee ring disappearing under hot water. The house felt too big, the sewing room too quiet. In the hall, the garment bag with the dress hung like an unanswered question. By noon, I couldn't stand the walls pressing in. I wrapped my scarf around my neck and drove into town. The market by the lake was bustling, stalls lined with winter produce, the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke curling through the air. I moved through the crowd slowly, taking in the clink of jars on display, the soft thud of boots on wooden planks. I passed a stand selling hand-woven scarves, another with jars of amber honey. At the far end, under a green awning, I spotted Delia's stall. "Margaret, I was hoping you'd wander this way," she called, her hands busy arranging a display of vintage brooches. Her smile was genuine, one of the few I'd seen in weeks. She pulled me in for a hug, her coat smelling faintly of lavender. "What brings you out on a chilly day like this?" she asked. "Needed air," I said. "And maybe a reminder there's life beyond wedding checklists." Delia's eyes softened. "You've been keeping to yourself?" "I've been kept to myself," I replied. She didn't press. Instead, she held up a brooch shaped like a lily, silver petals edged in tiny rhinestones. "This made me think of you," she said. I ran my fingers over the cool metal. It's beautiful, like your beadwork, she added. Speaking of, remember that bridal fair booth I mentioned? I still have that open slot. I hesitated. The thought of stepping into a room full of brides and vendors made my stomach tighten. I don't know if I'm. You are, she said firmly. In fact, I've got a fitting later today. One of my clients saw a photo of your work on my phone and nearly fainted. I told her you might stop by. I raised an eyebrow. You showed her? Guilty. And she wants to meet you. We walked together toward the coffee stall, the wind off the lake lifting strands of my hair. The smell of fresh, ground beans was rich and earthy. Delia ordered 2 cappuccinos and handed me one. Don't let them push you into the shadows, Margaret, she said. You've got more light in you than they can handle. Her words settled in my chest, warm as the coffee. We found a bench near the water. Across the lake, the hills were dusted with snow, the pines standing dark against the sky. Delia talked about her shop's busy season, how brides were craving something unique, something that felt like it had a soul. That's you, she said. Your pieces carry stories. I thought of the gown in my sewing room, the hours stitched into every seam, the laughter around that dinner table when they dismissed it, the ledger with its unbalanced columns. Stories aren't always happy, I said. No, Delia agreed. But the ending's yours to write. The market began to thin as the afternoon wore on. We finished our coffee, and Delia checked her watch. I've got to get back to the shop for that fitting. Come with me. Just watch if you want. No pressure. I followed her through town, the wind sharp against my cheeks. Her shop's windows were dressed with mannequins in lace and tulle, their skirts spilling like clouds. Inside, the air was warm and scented with fabric and fresh flowers. The client, a young woman named Amara, stood on the fitting pedestal, her dark hair swept into a low bun. She wore a gown from Delia's collection, but her eyes were on the photo in her hand. This is the one, Amara said, holding it out to me. It was a picture of my dress, my beadwork, my stitch pattern. I felt the weight of her gaze. That was made for my daughter. It's perfect, she said simply. I don't want anything else. Delia stepped in. We can't give her that exact gown. It's spoken for, but Margaret could make something inspired by it. The words hung in the air. My hands tingled, as if they remembered the feel of the fabric. I'll think about it, I told Amara. After she left, Delia leaned against the counter. You're not invisible here? I looked around the shop, the bolts of silk, the trays of beads, the mannequins waiting for shape. I'm starting to believe you. As I stepped back out into the late afternoon light, the lake wind caught my scarf, and I let it. The cold didn't bite as hard. The market was nearly empty now, the stalls packing up, the scent of wood smoke fading. The isolation was still there, but so was something else, a thread of connection, stretched between me and the people who still saw me. Back home, I hung the silver lily brooch on my sewing room pinboard. It caught the last of the day's light, glinting like a promise. Careful! Don't let her near the cake! She might drop it! The words sliced through the ballroom like a champagne cork gone wrong. Heads turned. Some laughed under their breath. Others sipped their drinks and pretended they hadn't heard. I froze, holding the tray of petit fours. My hands were steady. My pulse was not. The reception hall was a chandeliered cavern, the kind of place where every surface gleamed. Tall arrangements of white roses towered over tables draped in linen. The air was thick with the mingled scent of flowers, perfume, and roast duck. It was the rehearsal dinner, though from the size of the guest list, you'd think it was the wedding itself. Lillian floated in a sea of pale silk, Daniel at her side, both laughing at something his best man had said. The remark had come from Daniel's mother, sharp as crystal. She smiled when our eyes met, a smile so polite it burned. Oh, Margaret, you know I'm just teasing. Teasing feels different when everyone hears it. It lands heavier. I placed the tray on the dessert table and smoothed my dress. Navy modest, chosen to blend rather than stand out. Apparently it wasn't invisible enough. A waiter whisked by, carrying a silver bucket of champagne. I caught the scent of yeast and fruit, the faint hiss of bubbles. Across the room, Lillian glanced my way, then quickly back to her conversation. I drifted toward the edge of the room, where the light was softer and the music from the string quartet didn't seem so loud. From here, I could see everything. Daniel's uncle boasting about his latest real estate deal, a cluster of bridesmaids comparing manicures, the photographer weaving between tables, and there, on the far wall, an easel with the seating chart for tomorrow's ceremony. My name wasn't there. I felt it before I confirmed it. I walked over slowly, as if it didn't matter, as if I were just curious. My eyes scanned the neat calligraphy. Family table. Daniel's parents, his siblings, their spouses. Lillian's side cousins, aunts, friends. No, Mom? No, Margaret? The tightness in my chest turned cold. Margaret? A voice behind me said. I turned to see Delia, dressed in deep green satin, a flute of champagne in her hand. She'd been invited as a vendor turned friend. I was wondering if you'd noticed. Her eyes flicked to the chart. You're listed with the extended guests. Table 12. Table 12 was near the kitchen doors. I could almost hear the clatter of plates. I guess they didn't want me too close to the cake, I said, my tone light but my voice steady. Delia's brow furrowed. They're making a mistake. We moved back toward the crowd, but I stayed near the wall. The speeches were starting. Daniel's father took the microphone, talking about love and family and the joy of joining two households. When it was Lillian's turn, she glided to the center, all grace and glow. I want to thank everyone who's helped make our wedding so special, she said. From the florist to the band to my amazing in-laws, who have been so supportive. Applause. Smiles. And, she continued, to those who contributed in their own way, big or small, we're grateful. It was the small that landed like a slap. I heard a clink near me. A young server had dropped a fork. I bent to pick it up, and as I straightened, I saw it an open folder on the side table, beside the sound equipment. A page half pulled out, showing a vendor contract. The top line, Bridal Fair Booth Rental March 14. The name on it wasn't Delia's. It was Daniel's mother. I took one slow step closer. The print below listed the booth's location. Prime spot, center aisle. My pulse shifted from hurt to alert. Because that booth, it had been empty last I heard. I moved away before anyone noticed me looking. Dessert was served. I sat at table 12, the clatter of kitchen trays behind me. From here, the speeches were muffled, but the glances were clear, quick, assessing, deciding whether I was a guest or just an obligation. Delia slipped into the seat beside me. You saw something. Didn't you? Maybe, I said. She didn't press. We ate in silence, the lemon tart on my plate sharp and sweet, the crust crumbling under my fork. When the dancing began, I stayed seated. The band switched from the quartet to a jazz trio, the bass line smooth against the chatter. Lillian twirled in Daniel's arms, her smile wide. I wondered if she even knew where I was sitting. The humiliation was public, but the shift in me was private. By the time the evening wound down, the folder was gone from the side table. But I'd memorized what I needed. Outside, the air was cold and damp. My breath rose in clouds as I walked to my car. The reflection of the ballroom's lights shimmered on the wet pavement. I sat behind the wheel, hands on the steering wheel, and let the night settle around me. In my mind, I saw the booth at the bridal fair, the contract, the name on the paper. They wanted me at table 12. They might just find me in the center aisle instead. The folder from the rehearsal dinner hadn't left my mind. Even in sleep, I saw it. Cream cardstock, the slanted typeface, the way the top page curled just enough to show me what I wasn't supposed to see. By morning, my resolve had solidified. I needed to know exactly what that contract meant. The bridal fair was 2 weeks away. It was the kind of event every local vendor fought to be part of. Prime exposure, prime clients. Delia had been trying for years to get a booth in the center aisle. And now, suddenly, Daniel's mother had one? I started with a phone call. Morning, this is Margaret Lane. I'm calling about the March 14 bridal fair. My voice was steady, practiced. The woman on the other end sounded harried. We're booked solid, ma'am. I understand, I said, but I saw a booth listed under the name Evelyn Carter. I just wanted to confirm the details. A pause. Papers shuffled. Yes, booth C5. Contract signed and paid last month. Paid. Could you tell me the price? I asked as casually as I could manage. It's public information. $3,000? $3,000? I could hear my ledger flipping open in my head. Another line in the what they spend on themselves column. Thank you, I said and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table, the late morning light slanting across the wood. My tea had gone cold. The number swirled in my mind. 3,000 for a booth, when they'd brushed off my work as worthless. When they'd put me at table 12. Delia's voice echoed from our conversation at the market. Don't let them push you into the shadows. I decided to stop by her shop. The bell over the door jingled as I stepped inside. The air smelled of fresh lilies and fabric sizing. Bolts of silk leaned in the corner, and a half-finished gown sat on the work table. Its skirt spread like a pool of light. "You look like you've seen something," Delia said, coming out from the back. I told her about the folder, the booth number, the price. Her eyes narrowed. "Booth C5. That's the exact spot I've been waitlisted for 3 years. Now it belongs to Evelyn Carter," I said. Delia leaned on the counter, tapping her fingers. "That spot isn't for personal shopping. It's for showcasing work. If she's renting it, she's planning to present something. But she's not a designer." "Exactly," I said. "So whose work will she be showing?" We didn't need to say the answer out loud. Delia disappeared into the back and returned with a worn binder. "This is from last year's fair. Vendor applications notes. Every applicant has to submit sample photos. If Evelyn Carter applied, she had to provide images." We flipped through the pages. The plastic sleeves crackled under our fingers, the smell of old paper and ink rising up. When we reached Carter Evelyn, Delia stopped. There they were, 4 glossy photos, my beadwork, my stitch pattern, my design. It was the bodice I'd created for Lillian's gown, photographed under perfect lighting, cropped to hide the mannequin's head. But I knew the work the way I knew my own handwriting. "Where did she get these?" Delia asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The binder lay open between us, the truth laid out in high-resolution gloss. "They're gonna showcase your work as hers," Delia said, "right in the center aisle." The air in the shop felt warmer, closer. My hands curled into fists, then flattened on the counter. "Not if I get there first." Delia smiled sharp. "Then we'd better make something worth stealing." We spent the next hour talking in low voices, sketching on scraps of paper. Ideas spilled faster than we could catch them. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in months, focused, electric. When I left the shop, the sky was heavy with the promise of snow. The cold air cleared my head. I walked to my car, the binder copies tucked safely in my bag. Each step felt deliberate, each breath steady. At home, I spread the photos on my sewing table. The silk shimmered under the lamplight, the beads catching and throwing tiny sparks. Proof, right in front of me. Proof that they valued my work, just not my name. I opened my ledger and wrote a new heading, Fusser's Leverage. Under it, I listed the pieces I could recreate, the materials I'd need, the hours it would take. And at the bottom, I wrote one more line, As own the center eisel. That night, I dreamed of the bridal fair. The hum of voices, the rustle of fabric, the glint of camera flashes. I stood in the middle of it all, my designs catching the light, my name on every tag. When I woke, the dream clung to me like the scent of fresh, cut flowers. I didn't tell Delia everything. Not yet. There was one more piece I needed. If I was going to step into that eisel, I wanted to do it with more than just dresses. I wanted to carry the truth. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The clerk behind the counter was young, polite, and easily distracted. A few questions, a few minutes waiting, and I had it, a copy of the vendor contract Evelyn Carter had signed. Her signature sprawled across the bottom, but the design description, Field told the real stories of custom gowns hand-beaded by NL's my initials. I traced the letters with my fingertip, the paper warm from the copier. The satisfaction was sharp, but so was the fury. I folded the contract and slipped it into my bag. Outside, snow had started to fall, soft flakes dissolving on my coat. The street was quiet, the world muffled, as if it was holding its breath. So was I. I had the proof. I had the plan. All that was left was to decide how and when to show my hand. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling where the moonlight cut pale lines through the blinds. The clock on the nightstand ticked, each second louder than the last. Somewhere in the dark, the furnace clicked on, blowing warm air that barely reached the foot of the bed. Sleep wouldn't come, not with the contract in my bag and the photos on my sewing table. I turned onto my side, my eyes landing on the framed picture of David. His smile was the kind that made people lean in. In the photo, we were standing by the lake, wind whipping at our jackets, his arm draped over my shoulder. "Don't let them decide your worth, Maggie," he'd told me once, after a particularly bad run, in with a client who tried to haggle her down to pennies. "If they can't see it, that's their loss. Just make sure you do." The memory was so clear I could almost feel his hand squeeze mine. I pushed the covers back and slipped my feet into slippers. The floor was cool under my toes as I padded down the hall to the sewing room. The lamp on the worktable clicked on, spilling a pool of light over the scattered photos, the ledger, and my sketch pad. The room smelled faintly of starch and lavender from the sachet I kept in the drawer. I sank into the chair, the cushion worn to the shape of me, and opened the ledger to the page labeled as leverage. I ran my finger down the list of designs I could replicate quickly. Each one had a note: bead stock low, order Monday, use cream silk from bolt 3, add signature stitch, visible, signature stitch. David had helped me name it years ago, a subtle, looping detail at the hem that only I could do exactly right. Invisible to most, but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. If Evelyn Carter planned to showcase my work, then she'd have to showcase my signature. And that meant everyone would know. The idea pulsed in my head, sharp and bright. I could make something new, bolder, impossible to ignore, and have it ready in time for the bridal fair. Not just ready, front and center. I pulled out a roll of patterned paper, the weight of it familiar in my hands. The pencil moved almost on its own, lines forming curves, curves becoming structure. A gown with a bodice that caught light in 100 tiny sparks. A skirt that moved like water. Every few minutes I stopped to jot down a material list. Silk charmeuse in midnight blue, glass beads in silver and pale gold. A lace overlay with a geometric pattern to break tradition just enough to be noticed. The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the siding. The sound was almost rhythmic, like someone knocking gently, reminding me to keep going. I thought about Lillian, about the look on her face when she told me the dress didn't fit. I thought about Evelyn Carter, standing in that booth, smiling for the cameras, my work draped on mannequins with her name on the placard. And I thought about David's voice of, "Make sure you do." By 3 o'clock, the sketch was done. I pinned it to the board above the table, next to the silver lily brooch Delia had given me. They looked good together, the brooch catching the light, the sketch promising what was to come. I made tea and carried it back to the worktable. The steam curled upward, the scent of chamomile soft in the air. I opened my laptop and began searching suppliers, making a list of rush orders I could place. Some materials I already had, others would need to be shipped overnight. The numbers added up fast. My savings account wasn't bottomless, but every dollar I spent now was an investment in taking back my name. By 4, I was back in the bedroom, the sketch still fresh in my mind. I didn't bother trying to sleep. Instead, I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the first hint of dawn paint the lake in muted silver. The plan was forming in layers. Step 1, secure the materials. Step 2, complete the gown in record time, adding the signature stitch in a place even the casual observer would notice. Step 3, well, that one could wait. At 6, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen counter, my phone in hand. My thumb hovered over Delia's name. Not yet. There was something I needed to do first. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for the bridal fair coordinator. It had been years since I'd spoken to her, but I remembered her face. Kind, with a streak of sharpness in her eyes. The kind of person who liked having the upper hand. I typed a message of, "Hello, this is Margaret Lane. I have important information about vendor booth C5 for the March 14 bridal fair. Please call me at your earliest convenience." I stared at the screen for a moment, then hit send. The message flew into the ether, taking the first step of my plan with it. Outside, the sky brightened, the lake's surface catching the light. I sipped my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, steadying my hands. I didn't know exactly how the next week would unfold. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going to fade quietly. Not this time. The reply came just after 8 in the morning. "Margaret, this is Susan from the bridal fair. I received your message. Please call me." Her voice on the voicemail was brisk, almost cautious. I called her back before I could talk myself out of it. "Margaret," she said, "I'm told you have information about booth C5. "I do," I said. "And I have proof the work being displayed under that name isn't the applicant's." Silence hummed on the line. I could almost hear her thinking, would take misrepresentation very seriously. "What exactly do you want?" "I want that booth," I said, my voice steady. "And I want my name on the placard." She exhaled. "That's unusual. Booths are rarely reassigned this close to the event." "You said you take it seriously," I reminded her. "If you need the evidence, I'll bring it today." By 10, I was standing in her office. The space smelled faintly of coffee and paper, familiar like a school principal's domain. I laid the contract and the binder copies on her desk. Susan studied them, her brow furrowing. "This is clear, too clear. She submitted your work." She looked up. "I can reassign the booth to you, but on one condition." I waited. "You'll need to present something new," she said. "We've already advertised her designs online." If we switch now, we'll have to explain it to attendees. Make it worth their while. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. I can do that? The decision was made. Booth C5 was mine. On the drive home, the lake shimmered under pale winter sun. I rolled the window down a crack, letting in the crisp air. The plan had shifted from a whisper to something tangible, and my pulse thrummed with it. Back in the sewing room, I laid out the bolts of midnight, blue silk and pale gold lace I'd ordered. The fabric was cool under my hands, the scent of dye still faint from the mill. I threaded the machine, the click of the presser foot loud in the quiet room. The first seam was always the hardest, breaking the perfection of untouched cloth. But once the needle bit, the rhythm took over. The hum of the motor, the steady feed of fabric, the faint heat of the lamp warming my shoulder. I worked in stretches, pausing to jot notes or sip tea. The signature stitch would run along the hem, but this time I'd add it to the bodice lining as well. Hidden but visible to anyone who looked closely proof. By mid-afternoon, I'd finished the bodice base. I hung it on the dress form, the silk catching the light in deep, shifting tones. It already had presence. When Lillian called to check in, I kept my voice even. "Oh, just tidying up the sewing room," I said. True enough, though she didn't need to know what I was making. I went to the market before closing, picking up fresh bread and pears. At the checkout, the clerk asked about the wedding. "It's coming along," I said, smiling as if everything were normal. At home, I set the bread on the counter, sliced a pear, and stood at the sink watching the lake darken. The gown waited in the sewing room, half-formed but already whispering what it would become. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Mornings were for sewing, seams, darts, beads, each detail pulling the gown closer to completion. Afternoons I ran errands, met Delia for coffee, attended the occasional family planning meeting where my input was politely ignored. One evening, after a long session with the beadwork, I walked into the living room to find a message from Susan. "Margaret, I've updated the vendor list. Your name is now attached to booth C5. Keep this quiet until the day of the fair." I saved the message, playing it twice. Hearing it was like tasting the first bite of something you've been craving for months. The gown began to take on its full shape. The skirt moved with a life of its own, the lace overlay softening the lines without hiding the richness beneath. I added the last bead to the bodice one snowy afternoon, the light outside diffused and clean. Through it all, I spoke little of the fair to Delia, telling her only that I was working on something. She seemed to sense the need for secrecy. By the week before the event, the gown was finished. I kept it in the garment bag, hanging in the corner of the sewing room like a secret I couldn't wait to tell. The night before the fair, I packed my supplies: pins, scissors, extra thread, the silver lily brooch for luck. I polished my shoes and laid out my best navy dress, the one with the clean lines and deep pockets. I thought about what Susan had said, that I'd need to make it worth their while. I intended to do more than that. I intended to make it unforgettable. As I zipped the bag, I caught sight of the sketch pinned to the board, now matched stitch for stitch by the gown inside. The silver brooch glinted beside it, catching the lamplight. The phone rang. It was Lillian, her voice light. "Don't forget, Mom. Be at the hotel by 10 tomorrow. We've got hair and makeup for the family photos." "I'll be there," I said, letting her believe it. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet sewing room, my hand resting on the garment bag. The air was thick with the scent of silk and thread. The moon rose, spilling pale light across the floorboards. Tomorrow, booth C5 would be more than just a spot at a fair. It would be the stage. The morning of the bridal fair broke cold and clear, the lake a sheet of pale silver under the rising sun. My hands were steady as I zipped the garment bag. The weight of the gown familiar now, almost comforting. By 8 o'clock, I was walking through the convention center's glass doors, the warm air inside carrying the mingled scents of roses, coffee, and fresh paint. Vendors bustled around me, rolling carts stacked with displays, bouquets, and racks of dresses. The sound was a constant low hum, heels on tile laughter, the occasional clink of glass. Booth C5 sat in the center aisle just as I'd imagined. The space was lit by a halo of soft spotlights, the floor covered in white carpet. For a moment I just stood there, letting the reality of it sink in. This was mine now. Evelyn Carter was already there. She turned at the sound of my footsteps, her smile freezing halfway. "Margaret," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't expect. You didn't expect to see me here?" I finished for her. Her gaze flicked to the booth placard. My name was printed in bold letters, black on white, There must be some mistake, she said, her tone sharpening. No mistake? I replied. You'll want to speak to Susan. She opened her mouth, but Susan appeared then, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking on the carpet. Good morning, Margaret. Your space is ready. We'll have the press making rounds at 11. Evelyn's face tightened further, but Susan didn't look at her. If you have any issues, she told me, come find me. We're thrilled to have your work here. I set my garment bag on the table and began unpacking. The silk shimmered under the lights as I lifted the gown free, the lace overlay catching each spark of illumination. Even on the hanger, it commanded attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Evelyn take a step closer. This isn't over, she said under her breath. I smiled. No, it's just starting. Around us, the aisle began to fill. Brides-to-be with clipboards, photographers, vendors chatting with clients. The air felt charged, as if the whole room was leaning toward what would happen next. I draped the gown over the dress form, smoothing the skirt so it fell in perfect folds. The midnight blue seemed to deepen in the light, the gold beads winking like tiny constellations. My hands were calm, precise, as if every movement was part of a performance. When I stepped back, I caught a glimpse of Lillian at the far end of the aisle. She was watching, her expression unreadable. The day had only begun. By the time the clock edged toward 11, booth C5 had become a small island in the flow of the bridal fair. Brides slowed as they passed, drawn by the deep blue silk and the way the skirt seemed to move even without wind. A photographer crouched to capture the beadwork, the lens glinting under the lights. Evelyn lingered nearby, speaking too loudly to anyone who would listen. I've been involved in the design process for years, she told a young couple, her hands sweeping over the air between us. Every detail is carefully overseen. I kept my eyes on my work, adjusting the bodice just so, letting the signature stitch at the hem peek into view. It caught the light like a line of moonlight. I saw one of the photographers lean closer, curiosity in his eyes. A woman in her 30s stepped forward, touching the skirt lightly. It's breathtaking. Who designed it? I did, I said, smiling. Hand-stitched, hand-beaded, and finished with my signature hem. Her eyes lit. You can tell. It feels alive. Evelyn's smile didn't reach her eyes. Of course, she's been inspired by many sources. Actually, the woman interrupted. This stitch is unique. I've only seen it in one designer's work before, and she's standing right here. She looked at me again. Do you take commissions? I do, I said, handing her a card. The weight of it in her fingers felt like a promise. The crowd at the booth thickened. People angled their phones for better shots. I answered questions, explained the beadwork process, and let them touch the silk so they could feel its softness for themselves. All the while, Evelyn hovered, her voice thinning as her audience drifted toward me. At exactly 11, Susan returned, a small entourage of local press in tow. Margaret, we'd like to feature you in our midday coverage, she said. Your booth is drawing the most attention. I felt Evelyn stiffen beside me. As the cameras began to roll, Susan gestured toward the gown. Tell us about your design. I spoke clearly, letting the story unfold. How each bead was sewn individually, how the silk was cut to catch the light in movement, how the signature stitch had been part of my work for decades. It's personal, I said, like leaving my name on every piece I create. The cameraman zoomed in on the hem. Can you get that stitch? Susan asked. The lens caught the delicate looping detail, the gold beads nestled in the silk. Somewhere in the crowd, I heard someone say, "That's the same stitch from," before their voice was lost in the murmur. When the interview ended, applause rippled from the edge of the gathering. I caught Lillian's gaze again. This time her face was pale. Evelyn turned to walk away, but I knew she wasn't retreating, she was recalculating. And so was I. The noon crowd swelled as the fair's announcer tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin our featured presentation from booth C5. Susan stepped forward, her clipboard tucked under one arm. Before we begin, she said, I want to clarify something for our attendees. Booth C5 was reassigned last week due to a misrepresentation in its original application. A low murmur ran through the crowd. She gestured toward me. This gown, and the designs you see here, are the work of Margaret Lane, who has been creating custom bridal gowns for over 30 years. Her signature stitch is recognized by designers across the region. The cameras turned, catching the hemline in close-up again. I could see Evelyn just beyond the circle of light, her lips pressed thin. Susan's voice carried, calm but firm. It's important to us that credit is given where it's due. And today, it's due here. Applause broke out, louder than I expected. A few people actually cheered. I stepped forward, nodding in thanks, and lifted the skirt slightly so the signature stitch gleamed in the light. "Every gown tells a story," I said, my voice steady. "This one tells mine." Evelyn pushed through the edge of the crowd, her smile brittle. "Of course, we all work together in the family," she began. But a young reporter cut her off. "Ma'am, are you saying you contributed to this design?" Her pause was a fraction too long. "We share ideas?" she said finally. The reporter's gaze shifted back to me. "Can you show us proof this is yours?" I reached into the side pocket of my garment bag and pulled out the copy of the contract Evelyn had submitted. "This is the vendor contract for booth C5, I said. "Under design description, you'll see my initials, ML, in her handwriting." Gasps rustled through the audience. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Susan took the paper, scanned it, and handed it to the reporter. "This confirms our reassignment decision." Evelyn's color drained. Lillian, standing a few feet away, looked as if she wanted to be anywhere else. The rest of the presentation was a blur of questions, flashes, and handshakes. Brides asked about commissions. Photographers requested permission to use the images in their portfolios. Susan slipped me a card for next year's event with the words, "First right of refusal." When the crowd finally thinned, Evelyn was gone. Lillian lingered, opening her mouth as if to speak, then closing it again. She turned and walked away. I stood in the quiet aftermath, the gown gleaming under the lights, the air still humming with what had just happened. Justice, I thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands in the center aisle and lets the truth shine. From somewhere behind me, I heard footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn yet. The day wasn't over. The next morning, the house felt different. It wasn't quieter. Evelyn's voice had never carried through these walls. But the air itself seemed lighter, as if some invisible weight had shifted. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching a pair of ducks glide across the lake. No one called. No one knocked. By mid-morning, I received a brief text from Lillian. "We'll handle our own alterations from now on." No greeting. No signature. Just the finality of someone closing a door without looking back. I set the phone down and sipped my coffee. It tasted stronger than usual. The sewing room still smelled faintly of silk from the gown. The garment bag hung in the corner, empty now, its absence like the hollow in a tooth. I ran my hand over the cleared work table, tracing the faint grooves left by years of cutting and measuring. A knock came just before noon. It was Delia holding a brown paper bag. "I brought lunch," she said, smiling in a way that didn't ask questions. She set the bag on the counter and began unpacking sandwiches, chips, and 2 glass bottles of ginger ale. We ate at the kitchen table, the lake beyond the glass shifting in pale winter light. Delia talked about her latest clients, the state of the downtown florist shop, the weather forecast. She didn't mention the bridal fair until the plates were nearly empty. "You stood your ground," she said finally. "Not many would have done it with that much grace." I shrugged. It wasn't grace. It was necessity. She studied me for a moment. "So what now?" I looked toward the sewing room. "I think I'm done sewing for people who see me as an afterthought." "Then sew for yourself," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. After she left, I walked down to the dock. The boards were slick from frost, and the air smelled faintly of pine from somewhere across the water. I stood there for a long while, listening to the slow lap of water against the pilings. It had been years since I'd stood on this dock without thinking about someone else's deadlines, someone else's approval. Now, the quiet felt like an open door. I turned back toward the house, the low winter sun casting my shadow long across the grass. There were things to sort, things to pack, but for the first time in years, none of it felt urgent. Some endings don't slam shut. They just stop. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. The return address was Evelyn's. Inside, there was no letter, just an invoice from the bridal boutique, listing the cost of alterations for Lillian's gown, and a note scrawled at the bottom, "Your share." No signature. I laughed, the sound startling in the empty kitchen. The invoice went straight into the bin. That was the last piece of paper from them I intended to handle. In the days that followed, the silence became a pattern. No invitations to dinners. No texts about errands. No veiled requests for quick favor. The absence of their voices left a space that began to fill with other sounds. The whir of my sewing machine when I stitched something purely for the joy of it. the kettle whistling for tea, the crackle of the fireplace in the evening. I started moving things out of the sewing room, boxing up patterns and fabrics I knew I'd never use again. Some I donated to the community theater, others went to a local charity for vocational training. It felt like lifting stones from my own shoulders. One afternoon, as I was folding muslin into neat squares, Delia called. "There's a space opening up next to the bakery," she said. "Big front window, good light. It would make a perfect studio if you ever decide to take on private clients again." I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. "Let's go look tomorrow." That night, I sat in the living room with a mug of chamomile tea, the lake outside reflecting a sliver of moon. I thought about David, about what he'd say if he were here. I could almost hear his voice, soft, certain of "you've earned this." Before bed, I took a walk down the dock. The cold bit at my cheeks and the boards creaked under my weight. The water was black and still, the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own breath. I realized I wasn't waiting anymore, for a call, for an apology, for someone else to decide my worth. The fair had been the turning point, but this stillness was the proof. Back inside, I turned off the lights one by one. The house felt entirely mine for the first time in years. No shadows from their expectations, no echoes of their voices. Tomorrow, I'd see that studio space with Delia. Maybe it would be the start of something, or maybe not. Either way, the choice would be mine, and that was enough. Spring arrived slowly at the lake, the ice retreating in thin, glassy sheets. Daffodils pushed through the damp soil by the porch, their yellow heads nodding in the breeze. The studio space next to the bakery was mine now. It had taken weeks of painting, scrubbing, and hauling in the pieces I wanted. An oak-cutting table from the house, the old dress form with its worn linen cover, jars of beads arranged by color on open shelves. In the front window, I set a single mannequin dressed in a pale green gown I'd made for no one but myself. The mornings began with the scent of fresh bread drifting in from next door, and the sound of the baker's early customers chatting over coffee. I kept the front door propped open on warm days, the bell above it chiming as people wandered in. Some came to commission dresses, others came just to talk. A young bride-to-be told me about her grandmother's wedding in the 1950s. A retired teacher brought in a quilt her mother had started and asked if I could finish it. I said yes to both. Delia stopped by almost every afternoon, bringing scones or flowers, sometimes just a wave through the glass if she was busy. "You're building something here," she said one day, looking around the studio. "Not just dresses, a place people feel welcome." I thought about that later, sitting at the cutting table with a length of sky blue satin spread before me. She was right. For years, I'd worked in the quiet of my sewing room, making things that would be claimed by others. Now every stitch stayed mine until I chose to give it. One afternoon, a little girl wandered in with her mother. She pressed her hands to the glass display case, eyes wide at the rows of sparkling beads. "Can I learn how to make these?" she asked. Her mother started to apologize, but I shook my head. "Come back on Saturday. I'll show you." It felt good, better than I expected, to say yes without hesitation. In the evenings, I walked down to the dock, the air warmer now, the water alive with ripples. I'd sit there until the sun dipped low, the lake turning gold, and think about how far I'd come from that morning at the bridal fair. The quiet was still here, but it had changed. It wasn't the silence of exclusion anymore. It was the space I'd made for myself. By midsummer, the studio had become part of the rhythm of the town. On Saturdays, the front window was crowded with faces, children from the beadwork class holding up their finished pieces, proud as if they'd discovered treasure. Some of their parents lingered, running their hands over the bolts of fabric, telling me stories about the dresses they'd worn decades ago. One morning, I found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a single photograph, the midnight blue gown from the bridal fair, worn by a bride I didn't know. On the back, in neat handwriting, it read, "Your work made me feel seen." I kept it on the shelf above my cutting table. The lake was at its brightest now, the water flashing like coins under the sun. In the evenings, I'd bring a folding chair down to the dock with a notebook and a glass of iced tea. Some nights I sketched new designs, others, I just watched the light change and listened to the soft rustle of the pines. I heard about Lillian's wedding from someone at the bakery. It had gone ahead, smaller than planned. No one mentioned Evelyn. The news felt distant, like a weather report from a place I no longer lived. One quiet Sunday, Delia came by with a small box. Inside was a silver thimble, old and polished smooth with years of use. "My grandmother's," she said. She'd have liked you. I closed my hand around it. Then I'll keep it in good company. As the days passed, I realized the studio was more than a workspace. It was a place where people came to share pieces of themselves, joys, losses, dreams stitched into fabric and thread. And somewhere in those exchanges, I'd stitched myself back together too. On the anniversary of the bridal fair, I unlocked the studio early. The sun was just clearing the bakery roof, and the air was still cool. I set the midnight blue gown in the window for the first time since that day. The light caught the signature stitch, a faint glimmer at the hem. I stood back, hands in my pockets, and let the sight settle in. Sometimes justice isn't about taking something back. It's about building something so strong, so entirely yours, that no one can touch it. If you've ever been made to feel invisible, if you've ever been told your worth could be taken, know this: you are not alone, and you are not finished.